Hello, this is Pastor Don Phillips of the Abundant Harvest Church in Kansas City, Kansas. Hope you've had a great week. Hope you're having a great weekend. And I'm here to bring you a message today that I hope will bring encouragement to you, because the title of this message I have written, What to Do When You Have 185,000 Enemies Breathing Down Your Neck. Sometimes we feel like that, don't we? Sometimes we feel overwhelmed, like we can't figure out what's going on. That's okay. Most people can't either. But let me read to you a passage from 2 Kings chapter 19, the first 3 verses. It says, "And so it was, when King Hezekiah heard it, that he tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord. Then he sent Eliakim, who was over the household, Shebna the scribe, and the elders of the priests, covered with sackcloth, to Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz. And they said to him, This says Hezekiah, this day is a day of trouble and rebuke and blasphemy, for the children have come to birth, but there's no strength to bring them to birth." So what do you do when you have all these enemies coming down on you? When it seems like everything has turned against you. You're trying, you're doing everything you know to do, but it doesn't seem to matter. You thought you were well prepared for the situation, for any situation that came along, and now all of a sudden something is just not going right. Well, this happened after the death of King Solomon, when the nation of Israel became engaged in what we might call a civil war, and as a result was divided into 2 nations. The northern part, Galilee and Samaria, retained the national name of Israel. The southern part became known as Judah. In chapter 18 of 2 Kings, we see how that Hezekiah was a man who did right in the eyes of the Lord, like David. This has been said only of 3 other kings of Judah. There was Asa, Jehoshaphat, and Josiah, and there were 20 of those kings, and only 3 of them, it was said of them that they did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Now this is also where people tried to worship the true God contrary to the law of Moses. We must remember that Jesus had not yet come, and people were still under the law. Sadly, under Jehoshaphat, the people built their high places again, and they were not removed again until Hezekiah became king. Human nature is often that way. No matter how bad a habit may be, we're often blind to its ill effects until we are given some Holy Ghost guidance. Well, even at that, some people still rebel against God, but we rejoice nonetheless for those who come out of it and obey the Lord. The bronze snake that Moses made, so that the people who looked on it could be healed, it was made an idol as though it had some kind of magical powers, and that isn't what God designed. Isn't it amazing how that people will make idols out of even good spiritual thing? But God hates idolatry, period. So Hezekiah broke it up. This was another sign of good spiritual leadership. Hezekiah's best quality, I believe, was that he trusted in God. This is an awesome quality to have. However, even Hezekiah had moments of trying to do things on his own. And I think we all have those problems, don't we? To truly trust God is a quality that we should all desire. Because of this trust quality, Hezekiah was considered to be the best of all kings in the southern kingdom of Judah. Hezekiah led the people into a righteous indignation against Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. This is what brought on the Assyrian invasion. Hezekiah was anti-Assyrian today, so I guess some people would call him an Assyrianophobe. But he did not want to antagonize the Assyrians, and he was wise in his approach, especially with Sargon II on the throne in Assyria. However, when Sargon's son came to the throne, Sennacherib, he came to power. Hezekiah saw that it was now possible to take the Assyrians. So he joined an alliance with some neighboring nations to prepare a retaliation against Sennacherib. So Hezekiah was a leader with a strong track record of defeating the Philistines. However, no matter how good a spiritual or national leader that Hezekiah was, Israel still fell because of her continued disobedience to the law of Moses. Let me ask you this, are you listening to me today, America? Regardless of the type of leadership we may have, we have the personal responsibility to worship and serve God. And if we don't do it, God will eventually punish the continued disobedience to the laws that he has given us. Samaria, the area just north of Jerusalem, is captured, and Jerusalem is under siege now by the Assyrians. Israel's only hope was the help of God. I believe the USA may have reached that point by this time. Right now, I'm not sure what hope we have except in our God. However, Hezekiah had joined in an alliance that included Phoenicia and Philistia and Egypt, and together they were going to stop Assyria. Being certain that Sennacherib would try to crush his alliance, Hezekiah began to fortify Jerusalem. He was being prepared. He was a good leader. Well, Sennacherib led his armies into Judah just as he expected. But on their way to Judah, the armies of Assyria were so fierce that several of the allies of Judah withdrew. Things were not looking all that great for Judah. Have you ever counted on someone that let you down? You really put your confidence in them and they didn't come through for you? Well, what were they going to do without the allies? It was bad enough when he had the allies, but now Israel's almost standing by themselves. Well, eventually Sennacherib attacked all the fortified cities of Judah except Jerusalem, and he captured many people. The Assyrian king then set up his headquarters at Lachish, a well-fortified city near the Palestine border in central Judah, in preparation for his siege of Jerusalem itself. Understandably, Hezekiah did not want to fight Sennacherib, whose armies had been constantly and consistently successful against other members of his now severely weakened alliance. So Hezekiah sent a message to Sennacherib in which he admitted that he had done wrong in allying with other nations against Assyria. Then he offered to pay whatever the Assyrian king demanded if he would withdraw and not attack Jerusalem. I'm telling you, the situation is tough here, and it's getting worse. Well, Sennacherib thought that was a good idea, so he asked for 300 talents, in other words, about 11 tons of silver, and 30 talents, about 1 ton, of gold. Hezekiah paid him all the silver and the treasures of the temple and the palace. To get all the gold he needed, the king had to strip off all the gold plating on the temple doors and the door frames. But I want to tell you, this was a serious situation. Talk about feeling hopeless. Things were looking bleak for Hezekiah and the children of Israel at this point. But we must never forget that for the people of God, God always has a final and a last word. The ransom didn't satisfy Sennacherib, so he sent messengers to Hezekiah to demand a complete surrender. Terrible, after he paid the ransom and it didn't work. And Sennacherib's field commander spoke for his side and repeated his king's message to Hezekiah. What he said was designed to impress Hezekiah with the fact that it would be better to surrender than to fight and lose the battle. He even claimed that the Lord had commanded Sennacherib to attack and destroy Jerusalem. Though this is improbable, it's not impossible. We can read over in Isaiah 45 how God did it did do that. You see, the people of Judah had seen Israel, the northern kingdom, fall to Assyria. Could God's plan now be for Judah, the same for Judah? You talk about headaches. You talk about misgivings. You talk about uncertainty. What do you do in this case? Was God really fighting for the other side now? Judah's army was vastly inferior in both quality and quantity. So the commander replied that he had been sent with a message to all the people, not just the leaders of Judah. After all, it was the common people who would suffer most from a long siege and the resulting famine. The commander wanted the people to conclude that surrender would be better than resistance, and this relentless drumming was having an effect. Today, we might call it fake news. But I'll tell you something else. What he was trying to do was put a division between the leader and the people of Israel. So there were even classified leaks and, as I said, fake news involved in this siege. If the Judahite strategy was to rely on the Lord, the commander said they should remember that Hezekiah had incurred his wrath, God's wrath, he supposed, by removing the high places and altars where the Lord had been worshipped throughout the land. Where do you suppose he heard that? That must have come from inside Israel itself. Again, God always gets the last shot, and you remember that, always. That's why, with God on our side, we really have nothing to fear in the long run. Now, the top Assyrian officer called out to the common people standing around listening in and maybe peering over the wall, and his words were designed to undermine their confidence in their king and to encourage them to oppose Hezekiah's decision to resist. Have you ever heard the phrase divide and conquer? That's what he was doing. He was trying to divide the kingdom. If he could just divide the people from the king, he wouldn't have any problem with the king himself. He claimed that Hezekiah did not have the power or ability to deliver the city and that the Lord would not deliver them. It would be better for the people, he was saying, if they just surrendered. Rather than siege and starvation, there'd be peace and plenty plenty to eat and plenty to drink. Each person having his own vine, which is the wording that he used, really meant it's a figure of speech for enjoying peace and prosperity. Friends, this is psychological warfare he's using against Judah. The summit conference broke up and Hezekiah's 3 representatives returned to the king. He could see that they had torn their clothes out of a great distress, and they faced a very serious situation. Then they told him what the Assyrians had said. When the king heard the report of his messengers, he tore his clothes. That was a common way of expressing grief and angst. He tore his clothes also. He put on sackcloth. Think of that. Coarse goat's hair clothing that symbolized self-affliction and despair. Hezekiah knew that his back was up against the wall. The Assyrians reminded Hezekiah that the gods of the other nations had not been able to deliver them from their hand, and that God was not going to deliver Judah out of his hand. So Hezekiah went into the temple to seek God and to get an answer for what he needed to do. I think it's about time, don't you? He's done all this other stuff. I mean, he's prepared. Now he's wasted a lot of time and a lot of money, and he goes into the temple to pray. Is that not like we do? We try to work things out in our own way, thinking God will help us, God will help us, when we really just need to spend more time in prayer and in connection with God. But he also sent representatives to the prophet Isaiah, who lived in Jerusalem. I think it's about time he did that also. The king's representatives conveyed Hezekiah's message to Isaiah that this was indeed a black day in Judah's history. Their allies had failed them. Their military was already decimated. I've come to tell someone that this is an accurate picture of your personal situation today. You are even today living in what you would call a black day. Your close friends, perhaps even your family, and maybe even your pastor has failed you. And that enemy of yours, who goes about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour, is telling you that you don't have a chance. Other people were not delivered when they prayed. What makes you think you will fare better than they? You might as well give up. God has forsaken you. I'm telling you, hold on, don't give up. Quit listening to this enemy of yours and get into God's Word and get into God's presence. The people of Israel were greatly distressed. They were rebuked by God for their sins and were being disgraced before their enemies. A crisis had come to a head, but now Hezekiah knew there was not adequate strength in Israel militarily to resist their enemies. It was like a pregnant woman who's finally gone into labor but cannot deliver her child for lack of strength. That's the terminology that's used a little later in that chapter. It seemed as if the whole nation would die. Hezekiah's only hope was that, having been ridiculed by the Assyrians, Israel's God would act on behalf of his people and prove that he was a true and living God by granting a miraculous deliverance to his people. The king called on the prophet to pray for the small remnant of people left in Jerusalem and Judea. Isaiah responded to the king's request with a message of hope for the Lord, from the Lord. The Lord encouraged the king not to fear the blasphemous words of Sennacherib's commanders. God would cause Sennacherib to decide to return home when he heard a report of something that God had arranged. Isn't it great that sometimes we don't know what God is arranging in the background? We feel like we're standing out here on the back of the ship and the storm is tossing us around and we're about to go under. And all the time God has something arranged. And there was the Assyrian king. He said he would die a violent death. Wow. This is a guy that's got me backed into a corner. He's got my back up against the wall. He's got me totally discouraged and totally disheveled. I don't know what to do next, and you're telling me he's going to die a violent death. Well, the commander asked why Hezekiah still had confidence that he could possibly withstand the great king of Assyria. The commander punctuated his eloquent and attractive appeal with a call to choose surrender rather than resistance and certain death. He next focused on Hezekiah's promise to the people that the Lord would deliver them if they trusted in him. He reiterated that no other gods had been able to deliver their people. Why did they think their God was able to do it? Undoubtedly, those forceful arguments aroused much heated discussion among the common people after the Assyrian messengers departed. When Hezekiah received and read Sennacherib's message, which had been carried to him by messengers, he returned to the temple to pray again. And I want you to listen to some of the actual wordings here, but let me say this first. Remember when your parents used to tell you, try. And if you don't succeed, try and try again. Remember that Jesus said basically the same thing in Matthew 7 and 8. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened unto you. For everyone who asks receives. And he who seeks finds. And to him who knocks it will be open. I'm telling you today, if your prayer is not answered today, pray again tomorrow. Remember that Daniel testified that he mourned and prayed for 3 weeks before his answer came. Well, Hezekiah's prayer included a recognition of God's sovereignty, and he made mention of the deliverance of the Assyrians and a request to God for his deliverance. Then the Bible said, and I want you to notice this, he literally spread the letter out before the Lord, as if to say, Lord, read this. Hezekiah addressed him as Israel's God, whose throne was the atonement cover, or the mercy seat, in the King James Version, on the Ark of the Covenant between the cherubim. He alone was the real ruler of Judah, sovereign over all the kingdoms of the earth, including Assyria, and the all-powerful creator of heaven and earth. Hezekiah besought God to listen carefully to what he would say and to view closely what was happening. He then told God of Sennacherib's blasphemous insults. Perhaps this should have come as a lesson to us, to take all of our problems to God before we bring them to one another. God may give us divine wisdom before we try to handle it ourselves. But I love how this unfolds. He asked God to vindicate himself and to demonstrate that he was not just an impotent idol, so that the whole world would acknowledge that. The Lord's answer to Hezekiah's request came through Isaiah and was delivered to the king by a messenger from Isaiah. God assured Hezekiah that his prayer had been heard, and then announced a message of judgment against Sennacherib for his blasphemy. The Lord knew all about Sennacherib and his proud raging and rebellion against God. Because the Assyrian monarch hated God and had spoken strongly against him, God would take the king captive, as Sennacherib had taken so many other people captive. God promised King Hezekiah that Sennacherib would not forcefully take Jerusalem. It's not going to happen, he said. He won't even besiege it. He won't even shoot an arrow against it. Wow. God's already been designing this behind the scenes. And of course, Hezekiah had no way of knowing that except through prayer and faith in God. And in fact, God went ahead to say that Sennacherib would return to his own homeland without ever entering Jerusalem. Doesn't that promise sound good? Be at peace. Don't worry. Fear not. Maybe now I can sleep well tonight. But wait, God. You're talking about Sennacherib is going to return home in this grace. There's 185,000 Assyrians out there camped just outside our wall. What about them? Well, that very night, while the Assyrian army lay sprawled just outside the walls, the angel of the Lord came and executed 185,000 of them. Now I want you to notice two things here. First of all, that took care of the problem. But I want you to notice that one angel did all of that. And if you remember in your scripture, we read that when Satan rebelled against God, he took 1/3 of the angels with him. Well, that means we've got 2/3 of the angels on our side, and even one of them can whip 185,000 of our enemies. So I'm telling you, we're standing on good, positive ground. When the inhabitants of Jerusalem rose the next morning, they discovered the extent of the catastrophe. Sennacherib, no doubt, was trembling as he must have discovered the supernatural event that had taken place. He returned to his capital, Nineveh, in utter defeat. Shortly afterward, he was assassinated by 2 of his sons. Now let me bring this to a close. And I want to tell someone today, someone that's listening or watching this today, that it pays to trust in the one true and living God, the great Creator, Jesus Christ. He'll never fail you. He's never lost a battle. You can believe in his promises. Let this be your opportunity to find victory right here, right now. Bring the bad news, that terrible situation that the enemy is fostering off on you. Bring it before the Lord and just lay it out before him and say, Lord, look at this. Look what's happening. And then let your miracle begin to happen today. Why wait? God bless you. Hope you find this message a blessing. I hope it stirs faith in your heart. And if you're in the Kansas City area, we today happen to be recording this in Evansville, Indiana. But if you're in Kansas City next week and you want to come to hear us at the Abundant Harvest Church, we're at 4830 Shawnee Drive. Just come on out and be with us. And if you need prayer, get on our website and send us an email. God bless you. Have a great week.